Paul's letter to the body of believers in Thessalonica came shortly after a rather unanticipated visit to them in the early 50s AD. We'll see how Paul had not actually intended to visit these men and women, but had been redirected there from his original plans for Asia. At the time of Paul's arrival, this rather diverse city was boasting its own unique trade routes and had become one of the most economically thriving cities of its day. Let's get started. Thessalonica was founded somewhere around 675 BC, or before Christ. But if you look for a land at that time with that name, you won't find one. This is because the city originally formed under a very different name, and it would keep that name for about 400 years. The founding name given to this portion of Macedonia was actually chosen primarily because of two very specific characteristics at its time. You see, the land itself was known for these natural springs which would kind of bubble up from within the ground. They were prevalent and warm and came to be used in a very practical sense for bathing. Thus, the people of the day enjoyed these bubbling small bodies of water and greatly appreciated the warmth and the heat they provided. Now, while there was this condition of heat coming from within the land, there was also a very different condition of heat coming from within the people, but it wasn't nearly as pleasant. Just as numerous as the hot springs was a virus which was running wild throughout the land. This malarial virus was being spread largely due to the abundance of mosquitoes. Mosquitoes which flourished in that humid, hot spring environment, and the virus would often end in death. Thus, whether for the temperatures of the water bubbling up from within the ground, or the temperatures of the people rising from malaria, it was only fitting that the original name given to the land was hot, or, in the language of its time, thermi, or thermos. And you guessed it, it's where we today get the term we use when transporting hot beverages like cocoa or this hot cup of Java I'm holding in my hands right now, thermos. Now fast forward roughly 350 years to around 300 BC, and we see this land of thermi, or thermos, being governed by an exceptionally ruthless but passionate general named Cassander. He would later become king of all Macedonia, but we jump into his timeline at this point in order to learn how and why Thermi's name was changed. And we discover that the change was both politically motivated and romantically charged. General Cassander had chosen for his wife a woman of royalty. She was the half-sister of Alexander the Great and the daughter of King Philip II. These two men, King Philip and Alexander, along with Cassander, were arguably some of the most powerful men in all of Macedon, and Cassander wanted to impress them. Thus, by way of a strategic maneuver, he changed the name of Thermi in order to rename it after his wife, Alexander the Great's sister and King Philip's daughter. He changed the name from Thermi to Thessaloniki, or Thessalonica, and the city maintained this name through Paul's day and continues to do so today. Now we find in Acts chapter 16 that Paul's original intention was not to travel into Thessalonica, Macedonia. He was on his second missionary journey, traveling with Silvanus, or Silas, and Timothy, and possibly Dr. Luke, and was fully intending to travel into Asia to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ there. It wasn't until his journey was interrupted by a type of vision that he rerouted his plans and set out for Macedonia, coming first to Philippi and eventually making his way down to Thessalonica. What Paul found in Thessalonica was an exceptionally busy tourist and trade region with all of the hustle and bustle you might expect from an economically thriving city. The reasons trade and tourism were so prevalent within Thessalonica were largely because of where the city was located. First, this city was situated right in the middle of the entire Roman Empire, the most prevalent and influential empire of the day. Not only was it centrally located, but Thessalonica was home to two major places of travel, the Thermaic Gulf and what was called the Via Egnatia. Now, the Thermaic Gulf was important because of its access to the sea. It provided a stable and well-known port in the Aegean Sea, making it easy as it was in the first century, to transport cargo from other countries that would otherwise be inaccessible by land. Simultaneously, the Via Egnatia went straight through Thessalonica and was admired as one of the most active land trade and tourism routes available at the time. It was well utilized and connected travelers from the Roman Empire the whole way into Asia. The people who lived there and who traded or traveled there were relatively diverse and included a blending of Greeks, both religious and otherwise, and Jewish populations. When Paul arrived there, he found that some of the Greeks were proselytes, or followers of the Jewish religion. Some of the Greeks were pagans, idol worshippers, or following sundry religions and cult practices which were popular at the time and typically involved increasingly licentious behavior and corruption. And then there were Jews themselves. Now, while the Jews weren't the largest population, even the number of the Jews that was there was large enough to warrant the city of Thessalonica having its own separate Jewish synagogue. Building and governance within the city was driven mutually by men and women alike. Interestingly, the book Hellenistic Civilization describes their dynamics this way. It reads, Macedonia produced perhaps the most competent group of men the world had yet seen. The women were in all respects the men's counterparts. They, meaning the women as well as the men, built temples. They founded cities. They commanded armies. They held fortresses and acted as co-rulers over the land. This city was a city of diversity, licentiousness, strength, wealth, busy activity. It was a well-known, well-traveled city where men and women alike ruled in power, worshipped idols, and took advantage of all kinds of fleshly pursuits that were available to them. But spiritually, many in this thriving metropolis were beginning to sense the need for something different, something more, which is the case when we find our strivings ultimately to be unfulfilling. Christ led Paul there because of the need that these men and women had to hear and understand the freedom of Christ. This freedom would lead many of these Thessalonians to come to know Christ and experience peace and rest from their strivings with a level of fulfillment that they couldn't otherwise know. In our next episode, we'll look at some of the reactions these men, Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Dr. Luke, received upon their arrival. It wasn't all pretty, and some of what happened necessitated they leave after just a few weeks. But we'll also learn of the Herculean effort the Lord performed through these men, the role that Timothy played after their visit, and some of what prompted the passion behind Paul's first letter to what had become the first church in Thessalonica. I'm Jeff Lehman, Executive Director of Ministry 911. Find us online at ministry911.com. Thanks for listening.